The morning Claudia Marsh sent me a formal written request to use my private pool for the Cedarwood Heights HOA summer social. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading it, with the specific expression I reserve for documents that are simultaneously audacious and poorly researched, which is the expression of someone who has read enough legal documents in their professional life to recognize when a person has generated paperwork without understanding what paperwork actually does. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph requested access to my pool for the HOA summer social event on July 14th, from noon to 6 in the evening, for an estimated attendance of between 70 and 90 residents. The second paragraph noted that the HOA's community pool had been closed for repairs since May and was not expected to reopen until late August, and that the absence of a community pool during peak summer months was creating resident dissatisfaction that the board was committed to addressing. The third paragraph stated that given my pool's visibility from the community walking path and its clear capacity for group use, the board believed a community partnership arrangement would be mutually beneficial, and that the board looked forward to my confirmation of availability. I read the letter twice. Then I read it a third time because the third paragraph contained a phrase I wanted to make sure I had understood correctly. Mutually beneficial. I sat with that phrase for a moment. My pool was a 12 by 24 foot in-ground pool in my private backyard, fenced, with a separate pump house, a connected spa section, and a deck that I had designed and built myself over 2 summers. It held approximately 14,000 gallons of water that I maintained at specific chemical parameters that took me about 45 minutes of testing and adjustment per week to achieve and maintain. The pool was on my property. It was not visible from the community walking path, which ran along my northern boundary at a distance of approximately 60 feet with a 6-foot privacy fence between the path and my backyard. Claudia had apparently inferred its existence from the pump house roof visible above the fence line. I thought about the phrase mutually beneficial for another moment. Then I thought about what was mutually beneficial about allowing 70 to 90 people to use a pool I maintained at my own expense on my private property for a 6-hour period that would require me to adjust my chemical parameters before and after, supervise my equipment under load conditions it was not designed for, and absorb any liability associated with any incident involving any of those people in my pool. I could not identify the mutual benefit. I identified one benefit to the HOA and one party bearing all the cost, risk, and labor, which was me. I put the letter in my documentation folder. My name is Patrick Donnelly. I am 49 years old, insurance liability attorney by profession, homeowner for 7 years on Birchwood Court in a suburb outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, and the owner of a pool that I had built, permitted, insured, and maintained with the specific care of someone whose professional work involved understanding what happened when private recreational facilities were used by people who had not been properly vetted, consented, and covered. I knew more about pool liability than most people. I knew it in the specific way that a man who has spent 20 years reviewing cases involving premises liability, recreational facility access, and HOA governance documents knows things, which is with case citations and statute references, and the quiet awareness of exactly what can go wrong and exactly who bears responsibility when it does. Claudia Marsh was the Cedarwood Heights HOA president, a position she had held for 2 years and that she approached with the organizational energy of someone who had spent a career in event management and who found in HOA governance a platform for producing community experiences that she could put her name on. She was mid-50s, capable, genuinely community-oriented in the way that some HOA presidents are before the orientation tips into something else. The something else in Claudia's case was the gradual conflation of the community's resources and the community's needs with the resources of the individuals who happened to live in the community. My pool was not a community resource. It was mine. I wrote back the same afternoon. My response was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph thanked Claudia for her letter and expressed understanding of the community's disappointment about the pool closure. The second paragraph declined the request, clearly and completely, citing my pool's status as private property maintained under specific conditions for personal use. My homeowner's insurance policy, which explicitly excluded coverage for HOA-organized events using private residential facilities, and the logistical and chemical management requirements that made accommodating 70 to 90 users incompatible with maintaining my pool's operating parameters. I also noted, as a professional courtesy, that the HOA's request as written created potential liability exposure for the board if they proceeded to represent to residents that pool access had been arranged before confirming that access. I sent the letter certified mail. Claudia received it on a Thursday. She called me that evening. She said she had received my letter and wanted to discuss the liability concern I had raised. I said the liability concern was real and that I was happy to explain it. She said she had assumed the HOA's general liability policy would cover an event at a member's property. I said that assumption was likely incorrect and that she should confirm coverage with her insurance carrier before representing to residents that any event was arranged. She said she would do that. She called back 2 days later. She said the insurance carrier had confirmed that the HOA's policy did not extend to events held on private residential property and that the homeowner's personal policy would need to provide coverage. I said my policy did not cover HOA-organized events. She said, so there is a coverage gap. I said, there is a complete absence of coverage, yes. She said, what if we purchased event insurance? I said, Claudia, I appreciate that you are trying to solve the problem, but the coverage question is not the only issue. My pool holds 14,000 gallons maintained at specific chemical parameters. 70 to 90 people in a pool that size over 6 hours would require significant chemical adjustment before and after, would likely exceed the load my filtration system is designed for, and would require my active supervision of equipment and water quality throughout the event. She said, we could compensate you for your time. I said, it is not a compensation issue. It is a physical and operational issue. My pool is not designed or permitted for commercial or institutional use. It is a residential private pool. She said, I understand. I just need to solve the July 14th problem. I said, I understand that, but the solution is not my pool. She thanked me and hung up. I thought the matter was closed. It was not closed. On July 2nd, 12 days before the scheduled event, I received a notice from the Cedarwood Heights HOA announcing the summer social pool party for July 14th. The notice included a map of the event location. The map showed my property. Not the community pool. My property. The notice described the event as being hosted at the home of a gracious community member who had generously offered their private pool for the occasion. I had not generously offered anything. I had explicitly declined. I called Claudia immediately. She did not answer. I called the HOA management office. The coordinator who answered said Claudia had authorized the notice and that she believed the arrangement had been confirmed. I said the arrangement had not been confirmed and that I had explicitly declined in a written letter delivered by certified mail. The coordinator said she would leave a message for Claudia. Claudia called me the following morning. She said she had hoped that after our conversations I had reconsidered. I said I had not reconsidered. I had declined in writing. The notice had been sent without my consent. The notice needed to be corrected immediately. She said the invitations had already gone out to 92 residents. I said that was a problem she had created by sending a notice about an arrangement she had not confirmed. She said pulling the notice now would be embarrassing. I said sending a notice about an unconfirmed arrangement had been the error and that the correction, while uncomfortable, was necessary. She said, "Patrick, is there any way we can work this out?" I said, "Claudia, I have been clear from the first letter. The answer is no. You need to send a corrected notice to residents and you need to do it today." She did not send a corrected notice that day. She called me 3 more times over the following 2 days with variations of the same request. Could I reconsider? Could we find modified terms? Could we at least allow a smaller group? Each time I said no clearly, and each time I documented the call. On July 6th, 8 days before the event, I called my attorney Dennis Holt and told him the situation. Dennis said, "She sent a notice to 92 residents announcing an event at your property without your consent." I said, "Correct." He said, "And you have the written decline letter with certified mail delivery confirmation." I said, "Correct." He said, "And she has not sent a corrected notice." I said, "Correct." He said, "I'll send a letter today." Dennis's letter went out that afternoon. It was direct. It documented the decline letter, the unauthorized notice, the 3 documented calls in which I had reiterated my position, and stated that any person who appeared at my property on July 14th expecting pool access would be treated as a trespasser, that the HOA's representations to residents about my property constituted a fraudulent misrepresentation, and that I was documenting the full situation for potential civil action. Claudia received Dennis's letter the following morning. She called Dennis. Dennis called me. He said she wants to know if you would consider keeping your pool operational, but closed on July 14th, so that if she brings people past your property for any reason, the pool would not be visible as an inducement. I looked at the phone for a moment. I said, "Dennis, that is not a resolution. That is a request for me to arrange my private property around an event I have not agreed to." He said, "I told her that." I said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said she is running out of options." I said, "That is the result of representing to 92 people that she had arranged something she had not arranged." He said, "Agreed." He said, "Patrick, what are you going to do on July 14th? I said, "I am going to drain my pool." Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me why." I told him. My pool had been due for its biennial acid wash for approximately 6 weeks. An acid wash involves draining the pool completely, applying an acid solution to the plaster surface to remove calcium buildup and algae staining, rinsing thoroughly, and refilling. It was standard pool maintenance that I performed every 2 years, and that was overdue. The process required the pool to be empty for approximately 48 hours. I had been scheduling it. July 14th was as good a day as any other to begin it. Dennis said, "The pool will be drained for maintenance on July 14th. I said, "It will be in the process of being drained. The drain process takes several hours. It will be empty by mid-morning." Dennis said, "And if 92 people show up expecting a pool?" I said, "They will find a pool under maintenance." He said, "Patrick." I said, "Dennis." He said, "This is legitimate maintenance." I said, "It is overdue legitimate maintenance." He said, "I cannot advise you to do this." I said, "I am not asking for advice. I am telling you what my maintenance schedule is." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'm going to send Claudia one more letter today advising her to send the corrected notice immediately." I said, "Please do." He sent the letter. Claudia did not send the corrected notice. On the evening of July 13th, I connected my submersible drain pump to the pool's main drain and ran the discharge hose to my drainage easement at the back of the property. I turned on the pump at 9 in the evening. By 2 in the morning, the pool was at half capacity. By 6 in the morning, when the first Saturday light was coming up, and I was sitting on my pool deck with coffee watching the water level continue its slow descent, the pool was at approximately 2 feet of water in the deep end. By 10 in the morning, when Claudia Marsh arrived at my front door with 47 residents behind her, my pool contained approximately 400 gallons of water concentrated in the lowest section of the deep end, and a great deal of pool plaster, and my acid wash equipment laid out on the deck in the professional and organized manner of someone who had been planning this maintenance operation for some time and was executing it on schedule. I heard the knock at my front door. I dried my hands on my work towel, and I went to answer it. HOA Karen demanded my pool for her party, so I drained it and let the chaos begin. 47 people on my front porch is a specific thing. Not a crowd in the way that 100 people is a crowd. 47 people on a residential front porch is more intimate than that, more impossible to avoid. Arranged in the specific configuration of people who have arrived somewhere together and whose collective expectation has not yet been revised to match what they are about to find out. I opened the door. Claudia was at the front. She was wearing a swimsuit cover-up and carrying a tote bag with towels visible at the top, and she had the expression of someone who had arrived at a place she had promised to other people and was now making rapid calculations about how the next 30 seconds were going to go. Behind her, I could see the 46 residents she had brought, ranging from young families with children in floaties around their waists to older couples with folding chairs and coolers, all of them assembled in the good-natured anticipation of people who had been told they were going to a pool party and who had prepared accordingly. I said, "Good morning." Claudia said, "Patrick." I said, "Claudia." She said, "Is the pool ready?" I said, "The pool is undergoing its biennial acid wash. I started the drain last night. The equipment is set up on the deck." Claudia stared at me. I said I mentioned in my initial decline letter that my pool was privately maintained at specific operating parameters. Biennial acid washing is part of that maintenance protocol. It is scheduled today. She said, "You drained it." I said, "I am in the process of acid washing it, yes." She said, "You knew about today." I said I knew that you had sent a notice to residents about an event at my property that I had declined to host, yes. I also knew that my pool needed its acid wash. Those two facts are not related to each other. Claudia turned around and looked at the 46 people behind her. Some of them were beginning to understand what was happening. A man near the back with 2 children in floaties looked at the house, looked at Claudia and said, "Is the pool closed?" Claudia said, "There is a maintenance issue." I said, "The pool is being acid washed. It will be unavailable for approximately 48 hours and then will require 72 hours of chemical rebalancing before use. It should be operational again in approximately 5 days. The man with the floaties said, "So there's no pool party?" I said there was no pool party arrangement. I declined the HOA's request to use my pool in a letter delivered June 22nd. I reiterated that position in 3 phone calls and through my attorney's letter of July 6th. I looked at Claudia. I said, "I am sorry that the residents were not informed of that before today." The specific quality of Claudia's expression at that moment was something I will describe as the expression of a person who has been wrong in a way that is now visible to the 46 people she is responsible for and who has no remaining path that does not involve acknowledging the wrong. A woman near the front, holding a casserole dish covered in foil that she had apparently brought as a contribution to the non-existent pool party, said, "Claudia, did you confirm this arrangement?" Claudia said, "I was working on it." The woman said, "Working on it." Claudia said, "I expected it to work out." The woman looked at the casserole dish in her hands. She looked at me. She said, "I am sorry for the inconvenience." I said, "You have nothing to apologize for. I am sorry you were given inaccurate information." The group began the specific dispersal of 47 people who have realized a destination does not exist, which is slower and more complicated than the dispersal of a group that was never assembled, with more lingering and more conversation and more visible processing of what had just happened. Several people apologized to me on their way out, which I found genuinely touching because they were the wronged parties in this situation, and they were apologizing to me out of the general social discomfort of the situation rather than any actual responsibility. I told each of them the same thing, which was that I was sorry for the inconvenience and that I hoped they found a good way to spend their Saturday. Claudia was the last one on my porch. She said, "You did this on purpose." I said, "My pool needed its acid wash. I scheduled it." She said, "You scheduled it today." I said, "Maintenance schedules are mine to set." She said, "You are going to hear from the board about this." I said, "Claudia, the board has no authority over my pool maintenance schedule. If the board wishes to address the situation, I would suggest the more productive discussion is how a notice went out to 92 residents announcing an event at my property without my consent." She said, "I thought you would change your mind." I said, "I told you in writing and 3 times by phone that I would not." She said, "I needed a solution." I said, "I understand that, but the solution you chose was to represent to 92 people that you had arranged something you had not arranged. That is the decision that needs to be addressed." She stood there for another moment. Then she picked up her tote bag and walked down my front steps. I watched her go. Then I went back to the pool deck and continued my acid wash. The acid wash took most of the day. I worked through it methodically, the way I worked through everything, and by evening the plaster was clean and the rinse was done and I had started the refill process. Dennis called me at 4. He said, "How did the morning go?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 47 people. I said, "With floaties and a casserole." He said, "Patrick." I said, "Dennis." He said, "The acid wash was scheduled." I said, "It was overdue." He said, "Right." He said, "She is going to bring this to the board." I said, "I expect so." He said, "The board meeting is going to be interesting." I said, "I intend to attend." The board meeting was the following Tuesday. I arrived with my documentation folder, which contained the original decline letter with certified mail confirmation, records of the 3 calls in which I had reiterated my position, Dennis's letter of July 6th with delivery confirmation, the HOA's event notice with the map showing my property, and a formal statement I had prepared describing the full sequence of events. Claudia had called the meeting specifically to address what she described in the meeting notice as the failed pool arrangement and its impact on community programming. There were 11 residents at the meeting, in addition to the 5 board members. Claudia opened with a description of the community pool closure and the challenge it had created for summer programming and her efforts to find alternative options. Then she described the pool arrangement attempt and characterized the outcome as an unexpected change in circumstances on the day of the event. A resident named Howard Park, who I recognized as one of the men who had been at my door on Saturday with his family, said, "What change in circumstances? The pool was drained." Claudia said there had been a maintenance issue. Howard said, "Did Patrick agree to host the event?" Claudia said she had been in discussions with him. Howard said, "That is not what I asked." Claudia said the situation had been more complex than a simple yes or no. I raised my hand. Gerald Sims, the board vice president who was running the meeting because Claudia had recused herself from the chair given her direct involvement, acknowledged me. I said I want to provide the board with documentation of the communications related to this situation. I put copies of my documentation folder on the table and distributed them to each board member. The room was quiet while they read. Gerald read the decline letter first. He read the certified mail confirmation. He read the record of the 3 calls. He read Dennis's letter. He read the event notice with the map. He read my formal statement. Then he looked up. He said, "Claudia, you sent a notice to residents announcing an event at Patrick's property after he had declined in writing." Claudia said, "I believed we could still reach an agreement." Gerald said, "He had declined in writing. Your attorney had received a letter from his attorney on July 6th. The event notice went out July 2nd. He looked at the dates. He said the event notice went out before his attorney's letter and after his written decline." Claudia said, "I was trying to find a solution." Gerald said, "By telling 92 residents you had arranged something you hadn't arranged." The room was quiet. Howard Park said, "My kids were wearing floaties. I had to explain to a 7-year-old why there was no pool." Another resident said, "I brought food." Gerald looked at Claudia. He said, "I want to recess for 15 minutes." The board recessed. When they came back, Gerald said, "The board has had a brief discussion and I want to share our conclusions." He said Patrick's documentation is complete and clear. He declined this request in writing on June 22nd and reiterated that position multiple times. The event notice was sent without confirmation of access. That is a misrepresentation to residents that the board cannot condone. He said the board is issuing a formal written apology to Patrick for the unauthorized use of his property in a community event notice. The board is also issuing a formal written apology to the residents who attended on July 14th based on inaccurate information. He looked at Claudia. He said the board is further requesting that Claudia step back from her role as event planning lead for the remainder of the season, while the board reviews the protocols for confirming arrangements before public communication. Claudia said that is not necessary. Gerald said the board believes it is. The formal apology letters came to me by certified mail 4 days after the meeting. I read them and put them in my documentation folder. Dennis called to tell me he had received a copy. He said, "Clean outcome." I said, "The pool looks great. The acid wash was overdue." He said, "I am sure it was." I said, "The plaster came up really well." He said, "I am sure it did." He said, "Patrick, I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "When did you schedule the acid wash?" I said, "I put it in my calendar on July 7th. He said, "The day after my letter went to Claudia." I said, "Maintenance needs scheduling." He said, "Right." He said, "And the fact that July 14th was the date you chose." I said, "It was a Saturday. I worked during the week." He said, "Of course." He said, "And the fact that you could see from the street that the pool was being drained." I said, "I ran the discharge hose to the drainage easement. The process was entirely on my property." He said, "But someone standing at your front door could see the pool deck from the front porch." I said, "My property layout does allow a view of the pool area from the front entry." He said, "So 47 people arriving on your porch would have been able to see the pool deck." I said, "They would have seen the pool deck, yes." He said, "With the acid wash equipment laid out?" I said, "Professionally and neatly, yes." Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are a liability attorney." I said, "I am." He said, "You understand the precise line between legitimate maintenance and manufactured consequence." I said, "I believe I stayed on the correct side of that line." He said, "You did. I just want you to know that you know exactly where the line was." I said, "Dennis, my pool needed its acid wash. I scheduled it on the first available Saturday after it became clear that Claudia was not going to correct her notice. He said, "Right." I said, "The timing was what the timing was." He said, "Of course." He said, "The plaster looks good." I said, "It looks excellent." He said, "Good, send me a picture." I sent him a picture. The pool had been refilled and chemically balanced by the following Wednesday. It was clear and clean, and the plaster, properly acid washed for the first time in 2 years, had the specific bright white appearance of plaster that has been correctly maintained. I swam laps the Wednesday evening after it was ready. The water was exactly the temperature and chemical balance I maintained it at, the same parameters that had been in my decline letter, as the reason 70 to 90 people using it was incompatible with my maintenance protocols. I was correct about the parameters. I was correct about the maintenance. I was correct about the line. Here is what I will leave you with. Claudia Marsh made a series of decisions based on the assumption that if she created enough momentum around an arrangement that had not been confirmed, the unconfirmed arrangement would eventually become confirmed. She sent the notice. She brought 47 people to my door. She believed that social pressure and the inconvenience of correction would substitute for an actual agreement. They did not, because I had documented every step from the first letter. Because the documentation made the sequence undeniable. Because my pool needed its acid wash. Know what you own and what you owe. Read your insurance policy before anyone asks you to do something it does not cover. Decline clearly and in writing and save the delivery confirmation. And if your pool needs its acid wash, schedule it. The timing is what the timing is. Drop your thoughts below. If someone has announced an arrangement involving your property before confirming it with you, tell me about it. And if you have a pool that needs maintenance, there is no time like a Saturday in July. The plaster comes up beautifully this time of year. End of part 2, approximately 7,000 words. Thumbnail text. She told 92 people they were coming to my pool party. I drained it the night before.